The mashal that is sometimes given is that we are like actors in a play. Imagine that world history is billions and billions of pages from the beginning of time to the end of time. And we have a one-page walk-on roll. And the director gives you a page. And the page says, enter stage right, slip on a banana peel, and break your leg. And you go to the director and you say, this is my only chance to get on stage. And I'm there for 2 minutes. And this is what happens? And the director says, if you would read the billions of pages that came before and the billions of pages that came after, you would see how essential this is for the achievement of all that needs to be achieved. And what Hashem is trying to convey to Eve in a way that a human being cannot really grasp is there's a certain interlocking, interrelated aspect, a holistic sense of reality in which the things that happen to us are not simply because of our own individual identities, but they are kind of a necessity in a larger scheme of things. They say at the Rav Chanan Wasserman, the great tzaddik and Kadosh, who was actually in the United States at the time of the Nazi invasion of Poland, but deliberately decided to go back, knowing that he would be going to an almost certain death, because he wanted to be with his Talmidim in Baranovich. And indeed, he was murdered in the Kovna ghetto, and there were very few survivors. But one of the survivors was a great Rav who just died a few years ago, Rav Ashri, of the Lower East Side. And Rav Ashri was an Eid Re'iyah. He was an eyewitness to Rav Elchanan's last words. And he mentions that Rav Elchanan spoke about the fact that Hashem has chosen them to be a sacrifice, so to speak, a kapara for the brethren in America. And just as every sacrifice must be brought with proper intention, if there are improper intentions, the korban becomes puzzle. So too we must have proper intention. And then he recounts that Rav Elchanan gave a mashal about what looks like apparent random destruction and chaos actually has a purpose in a longer future-looking sense. Imagine you had a field that was filled with green grass, beautiful grass, very beautiful and pleasant. And the harvesters come up, or the tractors come up, and they totally remove all of the grass, leaving the field a muddy swamp. And a person might say, why was this beauty taken away? But then he sees the wheat that eventually grows, and he sees something even more beautiful. But then the harvesters come and harvest the wheat, making it again a marsh. Every stage there is destruction, destruction, destruction. And then you thresh the wheat and you have golden seeds. But then you take those golden seeds and turn them into colorless, tasteless powder. And then the powder is mixed with water, and then you have dough, and then you have bread. Rabbi Chanan says there are many, many layers of destruction and chaos in the world. And although much of it is connected to the decisions of man, and I'll discuss that in a moment, but God, as a master chess player, so to speak, co-opts the billions and trillions of individual decisions towards a higher good. And therefore Hashem is communicating to Eve that what happens to the individual is sometimes a function of a divine plan that transcends the particular life of that individual to achieve a greater goal of which we are a part, entering on stage left and breaking our leg. That is a second approach to the book of Eve. There is a third approach that perhaps is even more meaningful. And the third approach is Hashem is giving Eve the good news that you're not guilty of anything. But Hashem then is not answering the question. No, Eve's question is, if I'm so good, why is this happening? Hashem is basically saying, you know, Eve, I'm not telling you that either. I just want you to know that I'm with you in this world. Meaning the whole purpose of showing Eve what Hashem does is that Eve should feel on a visceral, emotional level the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in his life. The message is, there's no answer you're going to get from me. But I want you to know that I am with you. I want you to know that when you walk through the darkness, when you walk through the fear and the trepidation and the uncertainty and the confusion and the pain, you're not doing it alone. Imo anochi b'tzara. I am with you in your pain. In that way, just as David HaMelech says, Gam ki elech b'geit salmavis, in the 23rd Psalm, though I walk in the shadow of death, lo ira ra, I am not afraid of evil. Ki ata imadi, you are with me. Shiftecha mishantecha, your stick and your staff, hema yenachamuni, they shall give me comforts. And all the Meforshim explain, shevet is a stick that you hit an animal with when the animal needs to move. It's a tool of discipline. Mishanet is a stick on which you lean for support. In life, we sometimes get the shevet of Hashem, and we sometimes get the mishanet of Hashem. But David HaMelech says, if I know that it's not chaotic, if I know that you're with me, if I know that you love me in the struggles that I go through, then that itself will give me comfort. Seen in this way, Hashem is not answering the question, but Hashem is removing the question in the first place. Eov sought answers, and he found God. Now, what's fascinating, again, going back to the Moshe Rabbeinu thing, is, so it turns out that Moshe Rabbeinu winds up in his excursion into novel writing with the same answer he got after Revelation. He asked Hashem, why? And Hashem says, not telling. He tries to explore all of the arguments in the book of Iyov. And he comes up with the answer once again, not going to tell you. But it almost doesn't make a difference. Because if I know Hashem is with me, then I know I will be given the wherewithal and the strength and the resilience to bear the challenges that I have in my life and to grow from those challenges. It's reminiscent of a famous story about a Jew in a concentration camp that was being kicked by a Nazi. He was kicked on the ground, kicked in the head, repeatedly over and over and over again. And the Nazi mocked him, and the Nazi said, "Where is your God now?" And the Jew responded, "My God is with me being kicked in the dirt." And that is how a Jew survives, and that's how a Jew grows. And this really moves me on to a related point. And that is, you know, one of the answers, and I put answers in quotation marks because on an emotional level, we really don't have answers in any way. But one of the approaches that's often stated is, well, you know, maybe evil is not such a difficult problem intellectually because much evil is a function of human free will. I mean, after all, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world where human beings have the capacity to choose good or evil, and that in turn is necessary because goodness is goodness only if it's chosen and not if you're pre-programmed that you have to be good. Right? And therefore, if Hashem makes a world where we have to have the capacity to become virtuous by choice, then by definition, there has to be the capacity for evil. So, the answer, again, I put it in quotation marks, double quotation marks, the answer to evil is, it's not a problem with God, it's a problem with men. Now again, in Iyov's case, things happened that were not really functions of human, but let's say even the Holocaust, right? God did not make Hitler do any of these things, or any of the Nazis, or the Poles, or the Hungarians, or the Ukrainians. So in some ways, in fact, the Rambam actually says this in the Moreh Nevuchim. In some ways, the Rambam makes the point, we should not lay evil at the feet of God. It's Pasuk in Eicha as well. But evil is a function of human choice. And although God is the enabler of human choice, so you could indirectly implicate God in the problem, but God doesn't need our defense, so to speak, but God's argument would be, I have to enable free will to maximize the potential of goodness in the world. But once that switch is flipped, there is also the potential for evil. Right? That's one way of looking at it. But, once again, and again, we have to be very kitzur, very abbreviated here, that might explain man-made evil, but that doesn't explain tsunamis, and it doesn't explain earthquakes, and it doesn't explain death of children from diseases and the like, because those are not, those are, as an insurance company would tell you, acts of God rather than acts of man. But there is another idea of Bechira that would even give us a bit of an insight, even in terms of so-called acts of God. And that is, okay, we have this complaint. Why do the righteous suffer, and why does evil prosper? So let's assume that from a systems engineering point, God put you in charge of the world, and you want the perfect world. We want the world in which things come out the way they're supposed to come out, in which goodness is always rewarded in the immediate short term, and evil is always punished. So let's imagine we had a world where every time you did a mitzvah, you got $1 million on your porch. And every time you did an Aveira, you got an electric shock, which would go up 1/2 volt for every repeat offense. Well, would we have a world where more people are doing mitzvos than Aveiros? Surely we would. But the moral significance of that would be no better than a pigeon in a Skinner's box, right? The old Skinner's box, 2 levers. One is a shock, and one is a piece of corn. Well, even a dumb pigeons are not even very smart. Even a dumb pigeon knows to press the lever with the corn. If God made a world where goodness would be immediately rewarded in the short term with no suffering and no negatives, then once again, there would be no moral virtue, there would be no perfection of the soul, there would be no devekus in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because goodness would simply be a matter of expediency, and avoidance of evil would simply be a matter of, once again, expediency, avoiding short-term, immediate pain. So in a sense, the same way Bechira enables man-made evil, because that's the choice that people have, in a sense, the system of Bechira necessitates that sometimes the good guys don't win in the short term, and sometimes the bad guys do win in the short term, because that assures us that the choices we make in life are not simply because of the convenience and the benefits. Now again, L'maisa, there's still a problem with all of this philosophical thought. What about the Torah's own claim? The Torah does make the claim, life will be good for you in this world. So there already, again, I apologize for not being able to fully elaborate on all of these ideas, but the Ramban in Chumash does give us an important insight. The Ramban in Chumash basically says that all of the Olam Hazeh promises in the Torah pertain to the Jewish people as a whole. If the whole nation keeps the commandments, then indeed even our physical life will be blessed. If the whole nation rebels against God, then there's Golus and Churban and all of those meta phenomena. But the Ramban says the Torah never makes the claim that the individual person will invariably be rewarded in this world. That's the mystery of tzaddik v'rala. In other words, the mystery of theodicy is God's justice for the individual, and the haftachot, the promises of the Torah, are only to the klal ha'umah, only, right? That's the Ramban's very important distinction between the problem of the book of Iyov and the promises of the Torah. The Ramban gives us a neat separation between these concepts. So, Bechira, free will, is critical to understanding this. Free will is what empowers and enables the man-made evil that exists in the world. So, from Bechira comes evil. But one can also say that not only is evil a consequence of free will, but evil is necessary to ensure free will, that it shouldn't be a matter of expediency, but a matter of commitment. But there's a third relationship between Bechira and free will. Between free will, Bechira, and evil. And that is the evil that happens in the world. Even if it's man-made and God did not tell anybody to do it, is often empowered by God to be a vehicle for our spiritual transformation, to bring out powers and abilities that were dormant within us, but which would never be realized in the absence of that confrontation with the abyss, confrontation in darkness. Here I would refer to you to a text that was not written by a rabbi, but it happened to be written by a Jewish man, Viktor Frankl's work, Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl, who died just a few years ago, was a psychiatrist. He happened to be Jewish. He was not at all religious. Well, he was not observant. I don't want to say not religious, but he was not observant because he grew up in a totally assimilated environment. But I think most all of us would agree that he was a genuinely spiritually intuitive person. And through his own observations, through the hell of Nazi Holocaust concentration camps, he was able to intuit many ideas through the Pintele Yid that was in his neshama. He was able to intuit many ideas that are consistent with Torah. And he discusses the idea that although a human being has very little control over what happens in our lives, and we don't know why it happens, etc., but the ultimate final control that we have is how we choose to respond. We can choose to respond with nobility, with optimism, with faith, with joy, with gratitude for what Hashem has given us, and with compassion for those who are suffering. Or we can choose to respond with bitterness, hate, and resentments. And that defines the human being in an ultimate sense. Seen in this way, going back to the beginning of the book of Job, the Satan is not playing around with, off-track betting with God. The Satan is making quite a powerful point. The Satan is basically the HaKadosh Baruch Hu. If you want Eve to truly become righteous, to truly become holy, the measure of his holiness will be, will he choose to serve you when it's not convenient, when it's not expedient, when he doesn't get all that he wants? That is the measure of tzidkus. Let me give you two examples. We had Pesach, and we're in the Sfiras Omer period, as you know, and as Rabbi Dr. Tatz so beautifully explained. But we had the Pesach Seder a while ago. And in the Pesach Seder, one of the elements that you have to, that Chazal say is part of how you make a Seder, is you can't just talk about Hashem taking you out of Mitzrayim. You got to begin with the negative. Maschil bignus. You have to talk about how bad it was in terms of slavery, in terms of paganism, achlokas exactly. But you have to begin with the bad, and then you proceed to the good. Now the question is, why is it important to begin with the bad? Why can't they just cut to the chase and say, God took us out of Mitzrayim? So there's a simple answer, which is a totally valid answer, but there'll be a little problem with it. The simple answer is that it is the nature of a human being that we appreciate goodness only when we contemplate how bad things were. A person who was ill, God forbid, is much more grateful for his good health than a person who never went through that illness. A person who was poor has greater hakarat hatov when he has economic security than somebody who was born in a state of prosperity. Although the Chavos Halevavos points out the anomaly that somebody who never suffered deprivation has ironically gotten more from Hashem, and yet we don't appreciate it. Right? Those people who come from countries of persecution, or Holocaust survivors, or Soviet Jews, they appreciate liberty and freedom much more so than people who were born in the United States. Right? So consequently, the simple idea of why you got to begin with the bad is only when I remember how bitter was the slavery can I appreciate the blessing of being free. That's a good, totally good answer, simple answer. But there's a problem with that answer. And the problem with that answer is, but wait a second here. It was God himself that decreed that we would be slaves in Egypt. God told Abraham that we will be enslaved in a land that is not ours for 400 years. Now, granted, he took us out early. He took us out after 210 years. He took off 190 years from the slavery. But am I supposed to be grateful for that? If somebody threw me in jail, locked the key and says, I'm coming back in 400 years, and he came back after 210 years and says, be grateful I'm here early, I might think, well, yeah, but why'd you throw me in the first place? So if the only thing we're celebrating is freedom from slavery that simply puts us back to where we were, it would appear that mentioning the slavery would be a cause of resentment, not celebration. So it must be that the idea of going through the process of slavery is not simply so we'll appreciate the freedom. It is not simply a light at the end of the tunnel, but there's a recognition that in the darkness of the slavery there was in itself a redemptive potential. What would that be? So I'll mention very quickly two things. There are midrashim that tell us that after Yosef died, and the Jews were in very high esteem at the time of Yosef's death. Yosef was the person who single-handedly saved the Egyptian economy by his storage during the years of plenty. There were Jews who took the position, if we are so beloved with the Egyptians, when we are separate and distinct in our culture, if we assimilate, if we intermarry, if we adopt their ways, how much more so will we be beloved? And there was a wholesale movement towards assimilation. And the Medrash says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu put hatred in Paro's heart and the Egyptians' heart to remind the Jews that when you try to forget that you're Jewish, you will have the enemy that will remind you. And the Beis Halevi says, that famous Gemara that the Jews preserved their language and preserved their clothing and preserved, they didn't speak Lashon Hara, etc. That was a consequence of the slavery. It was the slavery that gave us a sense that we're one nation. It was a slavery that gave us a sense that we can't assimilate, that we're not going to find favor and acceptance in the eyes of the world. It was the slavery that gave us the group consciousness. To quote Benjamin Franklin, that we have to hang together or we shall surely hang separately. And that was a gift. Had we not had that slavery, we might have disintegrated into 12 different nation tribes, so to speak. So that's one inyan of seeing the redemptive potential in adversity. Yetzias Mitzrayim itself was an example of growing from the adversity. The other was a pasuk that we read in last week's Parsha. The pasuk says in last week's Parsha, you shall love the ger, because you were gerim in the land of Egypt. Now, a ger, of course, means one who converts to Judaism, but the pasuk itself cannot be translated totally that way. It says, you shall love the converts, because you were converts in the land of Egypt. We were not converts in the land of Egypt, but the simple meaning is we were strangers in the land of Egypt. And here's what the Torah is telling us. This is very profound and very relevant to modern life. A ger is someone who joins the Jewish people without the benefit of family, without the benefit of connections, without the benefit of wealth, especially where in the time of the Torah, wealth was based on ownership of land in Eretz Yisrael, of which a ger could buy land, but he could never really own land because whatever he would buy would go back in the Jubilee year. So a ger represented, so to speak, the nadir of powerlessness, of lack of importance. And here's what the Torah says. When you are in your land, and you're prosperous, and you're powerful, and you're successful, never forget that you were once a nobody. You were once a slave. You were once despised. You were once the low person on the totem pole. And remember that. So when you see others who are suffering, you will know how they feel. You know, we live in a society where, you know, a lot of people are victims of abuse. And I don't want to get into, you know, the definitions of abuse. Sometimes people define abuse in a very, very broad way. And how does a person recover from abuse, whether it's emotional, sexual? So people have different types of recovery strategies. But a very common recovery strategy is to kind of create a tough veneer of self-preservation. Maybe to call it narcissistic self-preservation might be too harsh of a term. I don't mean to be critical. But a person's energies are devoted to distancing themselves from the pain, to become tough, to become strong, to ensure I will never be hurt again. But the Torah is giving us a very different strategy. The Torah is telling us, never forget what it was like to be victimized and to be vulnerable, because that will be the source of your empathy and compassion. And that is why it is no accident that even when Jews have wandered very, very far away from the Torah, the idea of caring about the downtrodden and the poor and the oppressed, that's why Jews were involved in civil rights. That's why so many Jews were involved in anti-apartheid. Even such a crazy movement as the Jews who became communists. I can tell you, a Jew became a communist, did not become a communist for the same reason Joseph Stalin became a communist. Jews became communists, although it was obviously a wrong turn in history, because they genuinely felt the pain of those who were the working classes who were suffering, and they thought, not having Torah or not being connected to Torah, that this was a way. So I don't laugh or disparage or denigrate those types of things, because the emes says they are coming from a Jewish source, although perverted and distorted in various ways. But it is a strangled expression of a Yiddish neshama. And where did we get that? Yetzias Mitzrayim. Many of you may have read a book by Ruchama Shein. Ruchama Shein, a marvelous, really great tzaddikas who just was nifteris a short while ago. And she wrote, more than 20 years ago, she wrote a biography of her father, All for the Boss, Rav Yaakov Yosef Herman, who was Rav Scheinberg's father-in-law. And the whole book is filled with all sorts of amazing stories. But I just want to tell you one little story from the book. He came over with his parents from Poland to the United States shortly after World War I. And he was 11 or 12, I don't remember the exact age. And the parents couldn't make it here, so they went back to Poland almost immediately. They left him, little Yaakov Yosef, to fend for himself in the United States. And this was a time when there were no child labor laws, so kids were working. And they set him up in an apartment or a room where he had to pay $5 a week in rent. As soon as the parents left, the landlord raised the rent to $10 a week. Little Yaakov Yosef could not afford $10 a week. He was evicted Friday afternoon. He spent the first Shabbos after his parents left. He spent it in Central Park alone on a park bench, having nothing other than 2 rolls. Of course, there was not even an Arab there. He couldn't even move around. And one can imagine, or maybe one cannot imagine, how frightened he was, cold, alone, no family, without parents. And after all, and what's going to happen after Shabbos? Let's say he survives Shabbos. He has no place to live. He has no job. And in those days, you'd work from Monday to Friday. If you didn't come in on Saturday, which was a work day, you had to find a new job on Monday. There were no protections for Shomer Shabbos. So one can imagine how just scared he was, and not only scared, but despondent, hopeless. There's just no way out of this. And the daughter recounts that he prayed to Hashem that night, and he cried to Hashem. And he asked Hashem for parnasa. He asked Hashem for a home. He asked Hashem, already thinking about he should eventually have an Eishes Chayil that he can marry and have children. But among his many bakashot, he asked Hashem that may I never forget the fear and the pain that I feel tonight. That even if I'm given the brachas of success, I want to remember what it feels like to be lonely and hopeless and powerless, so that when I ever see another person, another Yid, going through that, I will be able to help them because I know what they're feeling. And if you know the rest of the story, you know that Baruch Hashem, he eventually got married to an Eishes Chayil. He became successful in business. And in his home, there were commonly, 50, 60, 100 people sometimes. And these were not just people who came for Shabbos. These are people who sometimes stayed for months or years. And although he was zocheh to have his share of Rosh Hashivas and Gedolim and very distinguished persons, he also had as his guests and as his people who lived in his home, people that we might not be so comfortable with. People who were mentally disturbed, people who were aggressive, people who were sometimes violent, people who would break a cholent plate over his head if they didn't like it. And when he was asked, how can he be Saivel? Where does he have the patience for dealing with such people? He said, he knows what they're feeling. He remembers that night. And that is the source of his rachamim and compassion in the world. And there's all the difference between, you take what Hashem gives you, and it turns into the source of all that is good. I would submit to you that these are in many, many ways the true heroes of life. They're not going to be famous. They're not going to be in the New York Times. And they may not even be known in the Jewish world so much. In Yerushalayim, we come across many, many such people. But they're often very, very hidden. But they take the challenges of life and they deal with them with nobility and with grace and with emunah. Emunah in Hashem. Emunah that Hashem gives them the resources to deal with it. And in that way they sanctify HaKadosh Baruch Hu every moment of their lives. Let me give you a story from a non-religious Jew. Some of you, those of you that are into music, may know the name Leon Fleischer. Again, I'm using some of these examples because the Pintel the Yid comes out. That little point of Jewish light comes out of the neshama in all sorts of unexpected ways. In the 50s and the 60s, Leon Fleischer was perhaps the greatest classical pianist in the world. But because he was an obsessive practitioner, I guess every musician is going to be an obsessive practicer, if that's the word, he eventually suffered repetitive stress injuries in some of the fingers of his right hand, and the fingers became stiff. He could not manipulate them properly to play at a concert level, and he had to give up playing piano. For a while, he was doing left-handed pieces. There's a small number of pieces for a left-handed, that's one-handed piano, etc. But eventually, he stopped that. Well, it's hard for us to understand unless you're there, but for him, this was the whole purpose of his life. He wanted to commit suicide. He had no desire to live whatsoever. He was in a deep, devastating depression. Finally, after months and months and months of just catatonic depression, he somehow got the strength to become a teacher. He basically said, okay, I can't play, but I know a lot, and I can teach a new generation. And he became one of the preeminent teachers of the newer generation of classical pianists. And they won awards, and they got applause, and they became very famous. And he lived vicariously through their accomplishments. A few years ago, there was a new treatment for deep massage tissue therapy that was developed in Japan, which supposedly would work for all sorts of injuries that did not respond to other treatments. And his family said to him, why don't you try it? He was extremely resistant. He didn't want to do it at all because he says, I don't want to get my hopes up. I'm used to this. I do this. I'm fine. I don't need to reopen this pain that has been there so long. But they convinced him. And a miracle happened. He was able to play again. It worked. I understand that now he deteriorated, but still, but he got I think up to 5 years. He was able to play, and because he had been teaching all those years, his skills did not atrophy. That's a good story. But what is significant about the story is what he said. He said the following. Listen to what he said. He said, when I was a famous concert pianist, my life was about me, my honor, my glory, my being the center of attention. And God didn't want me to be egotistical. God wanted me to be humble. God wanted me to rejoice in the successes of others. God wanted me to be somebody who built other people up. So he took away my talent, forcing me to be a teacher of others, forcing me, as it were, to celebrate their accomplishments. Let them be the center of attention. And I did this for many, many years, and their joys became my joys, and their accomplishments became even greater and dearer to me than my own accomplishments. Just as Chazal say, a person is jealous of everyone except his child and his disciple. And then, he said, when I no longer had the ego, I no longer had the gaiva, I no longer had the self-centeredness. I had learned the lesson that Hashem wanted me to learn. He says, okay, now you can have your talents back. I understand that in life, we often don't see such a neat circle, although this was a circle that took 25 years. But we have to understand, the old cliche that God never gives you a test that you can't pass. Well, I would add another cliche. God never gives you a guaranteed pass either. It makes no sense for a teacher to give someone a guaranteed pass. So in every test, because of Bechira, we can fail. We can flunk. But the strange thing about Hashgacha is that God keeps on giving you the same test over and over on us. So again, there's much more to say here. And the truth of the matter is, adversity can exist on many levels. There is the awesome, difficult issue of death and bereavement and sickness. But then, there are numerous minor things that happen all the time. We're caught up in traffic. The milk gets spilled. In a more serious vein, we didn't get the job we want. Our 7th grader didn't make the basketball team. These are all disappointments. These are all frustrations. We don't always get the life that we want. But to paraphrase not such a kosher source, we get the life that we need. And that is the idea of growing from these struggles. It would truly be a tragedy if one would have adversity and not respond to it. But if one can respond, one can see the redemption even within the adversity. Not only the lights at the end of the tunnel, but the light of Hashem even in the middle of the tunnel.